been staying at the inn in Charleston, West Virginia for the past 2 days, waiting for a business partner to arrive from Pennsylvania. It was a cool evening, just about dusk, and I decided to go for a walk after supper to provide a much-needed break from my boredom. Within about a half mile, I came upon a high rock bluff overlooking the railroad that had been cut through the mountainside about 100 feet below. There, I saw a lone railman busy at work.
"Hello! Below there! Look out! Hello!"
The rail worker was standing at the door of his box with a flag in his hand, furled around a short pole. One would have thought that surely he couldn't have doubted from what direction my voice came, but instead of looking up to where I stood at the top of the steep rocks, nearly directly over his head, he turned himself about and looked up and down the rail line. To me, there was something remarkable about his manner of doing so, but I couldn't for the life of me say what it was. But I do know it was enough to attract my notice. Again I called out,
"Hello! You there! Below!"
In that moment, he turned himself again and raised his eyes and saw my figure standing high above him.
"Is there any way I can come down and speak to you?"
He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then, there came a rumbling vibration in the earth, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and the oncoming rush that caused me to step back as though it had the force to draw me down. Within a moment, a train came rumbling through the tunnel and made its way through the deep, narrow gorge and was skimming away over the landscape. I looked down again and I saw him refurling the flag that he had shown as the train went by. I repeated my inquiry, and after a pause, during which he looked at me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards in the distance, and I set out for that point. There, I found a rough, zigzag descending path that was notched out and led below, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually wet. When I came down low enough on the descent, I finally saw him again, and I saw that he was standing between the rails on the train track, as if he was waiting for me to appear. Once I stepped out near the level of the railroad, I drew nearer to him, and I saw that he was a dark, lean man with a silver beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His work post was in a solitary and dismal place as I'd ever saw. On both sides, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone blocked out all of the view except for a tiny strip of the sky. The perspective one way was only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, and the shorter perspective in the other direction terminated at a gloomy red light and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel whose massive architecture was barbarous, depressing, and full of foreboding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthly, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill in me, as if I'd left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him, but he never removed his eyes from mine. He stepped back one step, and he lifted his hand with a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth. He looked all about it, as if something were missing from it. Then he looked at me curiously.
"Are you all right? Is everything okay?"
I said while forcing a smile. "Well, I was just trying to figure out if I'd seen you before, and that's all," he said in a low voice. He returned his gaze to the red light. Looking around, it seemed all he had to do here was change the signal light to guide the trains and to turn the iron handle every now and then, changing the direction of both the tracks and the incoming trains. He took me inside his small office beside the tracks, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book, which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial. We huddled around the fire and engaged in some small conversation. His grave, dark eyes seemed divided between me and the fire, and he seemed to throw in the word "sir" from time to time. Several times he was interrupted by a little ringing bell, and he had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand outside the door and wave a flag as a train passed and make some verbal communication with the driver. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant. Yet, strangely, twice he broke off our conversation and turned his face to the little bell. Even though it wasn't ringing, He'd open the door of the hut and look out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of these occasions, he came back to the fire without saying a word, but he had an inexplicable air about him. Having warmed up a spell, I decided to leave the railman to his work.
I appreciate the work you're doing here. You're doing a mighty fine job. You seem to be pretty content, too,
I said as I prepared to depart. Well, I used to be, he replied in a low voice. But I'm troubled now, sir. Yeah, I'm troubled.
With what? What's your trouble?
Now, it's very difficult to speak of, but if you ever make it back out this way, I'll try to tell you. His response sparked my curiosity, and I promised to pay him another visit on the next evening. The signalman nodded and followed me out the door. I'll flash my white light for you, sir, he said in his peculiar low voice, till you found your way up. But listen, when you get to the top, don't call out. For that matter, when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out to me. I was a bit baffled by this request, and even more by the way he was examining my face, as if he was looking for some sort of understanding. Sir, if you don't mind me asking you a parting question, what made you yell out, "Hello, below there, look out," when you first arrived here?
Heavens knows. I was just trying to be friendly and get your attention, that's all.
You sure there wasn't some other reason?
Well, what other reason could I possibly have?
Well, are you sure your words weren't conveyed to you in some supernatural way?
Goodness no, my friend. What would make you think such a thing?
He spoke no other words. His dark eyes just stared a hole right through me before slowly walking back to his little signal house. What on earth did that mean? I thought to myself. The next night, I was right on time as I set out towards the rail, and after a brisk walk, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag, rocky trail leading down to the tracks. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of the clock, striking 11 p.m. from the inn. To my surprise, the railman was waiting for me at the bottom.
Well, I didn't yell this time, my friend,
I said with a smile as we came together. He cautiously looked up and down the rail line and quietly nodded his head for me to follow him to his box. And as soon as we entered, he closed the door and we sat down by the fire. I've made up my mind, sir, that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me, he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated and speaking in a tone a little above a whisper. The truth is, I took you for someone else yesterday evening, and that troubles me.
Well, who did you think I was?
No, I can't say for sure. I never saw his face. His left arm is always across his face, and his right arm is waving violently, the signalman said as he motioned his arm up and down. I followed his action with my eyes. The first time I saw him, it was on a moonlit night. I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, "Hello, below there, look out." I jumped right up, and I looked out from that door, and I saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving his arms, just as I showed you. His voice seemed hoarse from shouting, and he cried, "Look out! Below there, look out!" I picked up my lamp, and I turned it on red, and I ran towards the figure calling, "What's wrong? What's happened to you?" Yet, the stranger just stood there, outside the blackness of the tunnel, with his hand covering his face. I moved quickly, and within an instant, I was right near the man. I reached my hand out to remove his sleeve from in front of his face, but he suddenly disappeared. I ran into the tunnel, looking for him, almost 500 yards. Before I stopped, I held my lamp above my head, and I saw wet stains running down the walls and trickling through the arch, and it seemed like I heard a faint, phantom train whistle. All at once, I got spooked, and I tell you, I ran out of there a lot faster than I went in. It was a ghost, I tell you. And 6 hours after I saw it, the most famous accident on this line happened. A terrible accident. All the dead were brought to the spot, right where the ghost had stood. A cold chill swept over me as I listened to the railman, but I did my best to fight against it, and I tried hard to convince him that it was simply a coincidence, and all of a sudden, he interrupted me. "Well, sir, I'm not finished. 6 or 7 months passed, when one morning, just as the day was breaking, I was standing at the door, looking towards the red light, and I saw the mysterious ghost again. He stood there facing me, with his arm over his face, almost as a warning, I tell you. But it was as real as I'm standing in front of you now. All of a sudden, my bell began ringing, and before I could answer it, a train came roaring out of the tunnel at full speed. I noticed a carriage window on my side, what looked like confusion of heads and hands. I saw it just in time to signal the driver, and I changed the light to red. The engineer put his brake on, but the train had drifted past here, 150 yards or so, and as I ran after it, I ran along the side, and I heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful woman had died in one of the train compartments, and she was brought right here and laid down on this floor between us, her body laid right where your feet are, under a tarp. Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back, and I looked down at the boards at which he pointed. It's true, sir. I tell you, precisely as it happened. Now, sir, this is why my mind is troubled. The ghost came back a week ago, and ever since, I can feel it watching me. I can't get no peace or rest for it. It calls to me, over and over. Below there, look out, look out. It stands waving to me, and it rings my bell. Suddenly, my mind went back to yesterday, when the railman kept staring at his bell during our conversation. Just then, he leaned forward and continued. So you see, by this time you should fully understand, sir. What troubles me so dreadfully is the question I can't answer. What does the ghost mean? What is he saying to me? What is it warning against? What is the danger? I reckon you best be on your way now. Come tomorrow and you'll understand. But whatever you do, don't come yelling. The next evening was absolutely lovely, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not quite yet down, and I walked briskly on the path near the top of the deep cutting. I was eager for one last conversation with the signalman. Once arriving, I looked down towards the track. I can't describe to you the thrill that seized upon me when close to the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man with the sleeve of his left arm across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. For a moment, I thought I saw the ghost, but I quickly realized that near the signal office, there were a set of wooden poles with a makeshift gurney covered with a tarp that several men were standing over. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, I descended down the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What's the matter?" I asked the men. "Well, sir, the signalman was killed this morning. Not the man that belonged to that box. Not the man that I know." "Yes, sir." "Well, you'll recognize him, sir, if you knew him. His face is still quite composed," said the man as he spoke for the others. He solemnly raised one end of the tarp, exposing the deceased railman's head. "Well, how did this happen?" I asked. "Well, he was cut down by an engine, sir. There ain't nary a man in West Virginia who knew his work better. But for some reason, he wasn't clear of the outer rail, and it was in broad daylight, too. He had his lamp in his hand, and as the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. This fella here is the engineer of the train. He can tell you exactly what happened." The engineer, who wore a rough, dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. I was coming around the curve of the tunnel, sir, and I saw him at the end, but there was no time to slow my speed, and he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle. I shut it off when we were closing in on him, and I called out to him as loud as I could. 'Hello! Below there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake!' But it was too late. I put my left arm over my eyes so I wouldn't see, and I waved my right arm to the very last minute, but it was no use."